Ladies and gentlemen, please turn your attention to the stage as we begin our session. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panel on Building Better Cities and Scaling Housing Solutions, moderated by Vice President of Global Philanthropy at JPMorgan Chase, Diane Helfrey.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our conversation. And actually, welcome to LA for all of those of you who traveled here on behalf of people like me who live and work here. Sorry the weather isn't better. Would have ordered that up if we could. As mentioned, I'm on the Global Philanthropy team at JPMorgan Chase, which is part of our overall corporate responsibility efforts at the firm. I was really excited to hear that the theme of this conference is driving shared prosperity, because our firm strategy and our efforts are really kind of oriented around inclusive economic growth. And we feel it's very important to help more people move up the economic ladder. A key element of doing that is revitalizing neighborhoods to build better cities. So with us today are our distinguished panelist, Ross Duvall, to my far right. Among his depth of experience, Ross has actually been ranked among the superstars of think tank scholars by International Economy magazine. Mary Mack, head of consumer banking at Wells Fargo, has been named one of Fortune's 50 most powerful women in business, and twice as #1 on America Banker's 25 women to watch list. Jonathan Rose, among his other accolades, has received MIT's Visionary Leadership Award, and Jesse Vaughn, who was recently named to Forbes 30 Under 30 list. So really, who needs the Avengers when we have these people addressing our solutions? Housing endgame. So diving in, we know that a robust supply of housing is a fundamental element in any community development strategy that aims to facilitate economic mobility and equity. But 10 years after the Great Recession, solutions that address housing accessibility are still scarce. Many Americans still face daunting challenges, particularly when it comes to financial barriers when trying to access housing, especially in our big cities and metro areas. The rising cost of housing, driven in part by lack of supply, which is then exacerbated by restrictive zoning policies and other barriers, is contributed to many issues that people experience, including stress, overcrowding of living conditions, burdensome commutes when people are forced to move farther from where they work, and it continues to strain overall economic mobility and productivity. So when we think about the housing crisis that's being felt today across the country, a major issue is affordability. And we can divide the topic into 3 kind of tiers. Supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness or other conditions requiring housing plus supportive services. The capital A, affordable housing with explicit subsidies and mandates, and housing that's naturally affordable across the spectrum of all income levels. So just to set some context initially, if we could have this first slide. The homeownership rate, if you look over time, has really went up for quite a while, but then has gone down over the last decade or so. And the next slide. In California, as an example, this goes back even farther, but you can see there was a big rise in mid-century, and then since 2000, it's really started to decline again. So that creates some of the context, and we'll show a little bit more data. In fact, Ross, can you start us off with an overview of the affordability across the country to help everyone understand the scale and scope of the problem and the relationship between economic growth and the housing issue?
Well, thank you very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity to do that. What we've seen since the Great Recession, if we go to slide 4, I think it's a good example of that. It shows the ratio of median housing cost to median household income, but for renters. So that's what we're looking at here. And Now, what's really happened is we've had so much of our overall economic growth based on technology in specific clusters around the country. You know, we economic geographers have, looked at the factors that drive knowledge to concentrate in places and the productivity gains from that associated with that versus the forces of dispersion, some would call them centrifugal, pushing things out. And clearly, the centripetal forces drawing things in concentration, we have found increasing returns to knowledge inside dense locations. So what we've seen from that is so much of the technology-driven growth along the coast, especially in California, San Francisco, San Jose, Portland, Seattle, San Diego, but even along the East Coast, Boston, all the way down through New York and Maryland, and you're seeing that in Raleigh, Durham as well, showing up there in orange. So largely this is manifested in places that have had strong economic growth, very dense, with very limited additional availability of land. You combine that with restrictive zoning ordinances and regulations, and quite frankly, a bit of NIMBYism. Not in my backyard, and you've seen rents rise appreciably. And we haven't yet figured out how to solve this, but to be honest, part of me says it's a real opportunity for the center of the country because that's where I reside now and that's my mission. And what it says, and if you look at millennials especially, there's evidence that they're beginning to leave the coasts. And this hasn't been noticed much. You would only see it by looking at domestic net migration, excluding foreign immigration. If you look at domestic net migration, young people are leaving the coasts. And it's a new phenomenon. They have been coming to the coasts since the Great Recession. But when an apartment, a two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco, San Jose, and the outlying areas, goes for $5,000 to $6,000 a month, you have to earn, $200,000 to be able to stay there. And if you don't have the potential to be in the money, to have options that can be cashed in at some point, and you're beginning to start a family, you've got to question whether that's the right lifestyle for you. And so there is early evidence that many millennials are leaving the coasts and moving back to other parts of the country. So, as I said somewhat flippantly, is that part of me says this is an opportunity for what we're trying to do, but we can't forget the people who live on the coast and what the challenges are. So whenever you're concentrating more wealth and people in places, land rents get bid up, and they've really been bid up. So, this is the challenge that California faces especially. I worked here for 20 years. I came up with alternative affordable housing policies. The good news is Governor Newsom is now backing many of them. I wish it had been somebody who listened 20 years ago. It wouldn't be quite the mess it is today. But there are some encouraging things happening, and there's an appeal process in California now that allows for developers to come in, and even if the neighborhood is opposed to it, there is an alternative pathway. But that's the premise of the problem. Let me just show you one more map because I think this really gets to the tiers of housing. Let's go to slide 5, please. This is a bit different. This is a share of home-owning households that make less than $50,000 in income that spend more than 30% on housing. And if you're in red, it means you spend 61% to 82% of your monthly income on housing. That is just not sustainable. And you see the red and where it's concentrated. And this is a problem we need to fix because firefighters, policemen, school teachers, they can't afford to live in these places. And they're having to move farther out commute longer distances, which increases congestion, and it doesn't add to your quality of life, and it's more difficult to get good teachers and keep them. So that's kind of the nature of the problem and how we got here. Now we got to figure out how to solve it.
Great. So Jonathan, can you elaborate on Ross's comments, and particularly the gap between demand and supply, especially in the affordable housing space and market rate housing that's affordable?
Great, thank you. So interestingly, this is a problem that traditionally the way to solve it is to build our way out of it. In the 1970s, we did not have an affordable housing problem at all because we actually had excess production. The insufficient production started in the late 1990s, around 2000. We've been underproducing housing at all levels every year, and that has accumulated to the deficit we have today. So 20 million Americans today spend more than 50% of their income on housing. And approximately 11 million of those Americans are renters, and 9 million of those are homeowners. This chart is really, really important because what it's showing is that people who are earning under $50,000 a year, or under 60% of an area median income typically, have a significant share in spending more than this 30 to 50. So we think 30% of your income on housing is the right number. Now what's interesting is when you live in crummy housing, you also spend significantly a higher percentage of your income on utilities. In places where low-income people need to pay for their own heat, they can be spending $500 or $600 a month on heat, which they often cut back on. That leads to all kinds of other health issues. This also leads and then the last thing is that because of the lack of availability of affordable housing in the places where where the jobs are, poor people live farther away. The Center for Neighborhood Technology has done some very interesting work on the relationship between housing cost and transportation cost. And so poor people, because they need credit, in effect, so they're spending less on rent, so they're living much farther away, and then they're spending much more on transportation, either on the cost of owning cars or on mass transit. So in the LA area, people under $50,000 a year are spending over 90 minutes a day each way getting to and from work, which means they can't be at home to tutor their kids, and they can't be members of the PTA, they can't be voices in their community, et cetera. Just as a sub-factor, there are 12%, it's estimated, of the people who work at Disneyland are homeless and live in their cars and shower in the company locker rooms. These are people who are working. So although, yes, we have mentally ill homeless and we have low-income seniors, by the way, trying to live on Social Security of $11,000 or $12,000 a year, completely are priced out of this housing market. So, but also you have a lot of hardworking people who simply cannot afford a place to live. So I'm going to underscore what Ross said, which is the solution has to be higher production. The higher production has to be next to mass transit to solve both the environmental and economic issues of transportation. And the only solution to that is higher density. And we need the political will to do that. Now what's interesting is, because as Ross mentioned, people earning $120,000 a year in the Bay Area can't afford to live there, and many other places. Whereas this used to be considered a minority problem, it actually wasn't, because there's more low-income white families in America than low-income minority families. But it was considered to be a minority issue. It is now clearly an everybody issue, and certainly a majority family issue. And that means that there's a rising political consensus. So I'll end with, when I started in this work in the 1970s, if you made a list of the top 25 most important issues to people, affordable housing was probably number 23, if not number 25. And today, city by city across America, and it's not just on the coast, it's Columbus, Ohio, and it's all over America. Affordable housing is issue number one in the local elections. Yep. And if we can broaden that to national, we can build a constituency.
Absolutely. And just to, excuse me, throw in another statistic or two on the homeless issue. In California, there's an estimated roughly 20% of community college students that are either homeless or housing insecure, which is kind of a shocking number when you think about the size of our community college system here. And in LA, when we do the homeless count for the county, Last year it dipped down a little bit because we are putting resources toward the homeless issue. However, some of the fastest increasing subsets of that population were seniors and first-time homelessness. So it's really kind of staggering when you start to unpeel like the different subsets of individuals that we don't typically think have that particular issue. So Mary, what else would you add from your perspective that's not strictly housing related, but other factors that contribute in terms of, for instance, wage or income growth?
So it's some of the things that you mentioned and Jonathan mentioned, which is the trade-off decisions that families are having to make around healthcare, nutrition, things that are fundamental in school systems for school success. So you see it in issues that kids are having in classrooms, which then carry forward. But you also see it in millennials, for instance. 40% on average, of a millennial's household income is going to housing, which delays the ability to begin to save. And we know that that has impact long-term for the ability to be retirement ready at some point, or the fact that elders will, 75 and older will double in the next 10 years, and it's estimated that half of those will have issues with both healthcare and housing costs. So it's not just today's problem, it's tomorrow's problem in a way that's building on itself.
Yeah. So let's shift a little bit to some of the solutions. Framing the problem, it's a big problem, number one on a lot of people's minds across the country. So clearly the supply is one big factor that's driving the cost of housing, but there are other challenges that exacerbate that, including accessibility to financing. So let's dive into kind of the consumer and financing side of the equation a bit more. So Jesse, your business at Landed, excuse me, is an interesting customer-focused example, helping people live near where they work and tackling the finance side of the equation. So can you give an overview of your model and tell us like how you thought about developing that and what it looks like now?
Yeah, sure. I think one thing to just say at the outset when we talk about solutions is, in particular, when we talk about our solution, we're careful to caveat that we're not a panacea. So we're not a silver bullet. That being said, we've identified one particular thread of the issue, which is that the ability, in these high-cost markets, the barrier to home ownership for many individuals is not necessarily affordability. There are many individuals who can't afford an 80% LTV conforming loan, but there are many who can, but can't manage to access that mortgage because in these high-cost markets, it's all but required to have a 20% down payment. And then for many of those individuals who can get to the 20%, they either have family support, so there's an equality issue as well, so bank of mom and dad. And many of even those individuals are very financially vulnerable once they've dumped all of their savings into a down payment. What we identified as a needed solution or a tool in the toolbox, if you will, is a form of down payment support. And what we offer is ordinarily half of a 20% down payment. We'll provide 10% of the home cost upfront in exchange for 25% of that property's appreciation when the home is sold. And we raise capital from impact-oriented investors, some foundations, institutional investors, and we offer our programs, our down payment support, to a category of individuals we call essential professionals. The first group of which are public school teachers and school staff, as well as public colleges, the staff who work in them. And we've decided to focus on this demographic for a variety of reasons, but not the least of which because we think that they're essential to our community. We love working with them, frankly. They're a great demographic. They're incredibly great credit risks that don't always show up in the credit metrics. So, I mean, if you had a teacher or anyone else at the same credit score, I'm willing to bet that the teacher's job is more secure than average. So I think there's a lot of virtues that are not, in working with this demographic, that are not necessarily captured in conventional underwriting processes. But yeah, today we operate in high-cost markets across the country: San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, Orange County, and San Diego County, as well as we have active programs in Seattle, Washington, and Denver. And a question that often comes up is this really a solution? Is this something that people can utilize? Can a teacher buy a home? It seems just crazy, some of the pessimists might say. And it is really hard. But in the last year, we've supported over 175 teachers purchase homes. Most of them, I will say, are dual income, so either 2 teachers in a household or a teacher and a partner, or more. Sometimes there are larger households. But we've helped them across the country, including purchasing in San Francisco, San Mateo County, Oakland, downtown Denver, Seattle, and Bellevue, Washington. So it's working, and there are solutions out there, but again, they're not panaceas, and yeah, not panaceas, at least like supply would be a panacea, but there's the political will to get there might be a little more challenging than to kind of lob off these one-offs.
So what are you learning from the investor perspective in terms of the appetite to, invest to help the community more broadly, or help particular populations? Any insights that could be translated to other types of solutions?
So one thing I'll say there is that when we first got started, we started the company in 2015, and it took about a year and a half, 2 years to get the partnerships in place in order to do what we wanted to do, as well as raise capital. There's a lot of stakeholders in a home purchase transaction to get coordinated, and not a lot of time to execute. An ordinary home close date, in a highly competitive market, you have to bid, and then you have to close in 30 days. So we had to bring together first lenders, because they had to be on board with whom was providing all of the down payment funds, escrow companies. We had to, in certain states, title companies are separate, and in the investors who were putting up the capital. So, as well as unions and employers and all of these other stakeholders. As far as the investor's perspective, what we have actually seen, at least that I have seen in the last 3 years, is a transition in how impact is appreciated and interpreted. When we first started, we got advice from a real estate developer, whom will remain unnamed, a large manager of capital, who said, "I love what you're doing, but you should take out the impact slide from your capital raising deck. People will just, brush over it. They'll write you off because they'll think that your financing is concessionary if you put that in the deck." When we truly believe that our financing provides market rate returns, we have chosen to focus on a demographic that provides impact to our communities. But that is a lot of words to explain to someone when you're asking for $1 million or $10 million or $50 million. Because if they write you off in that first 30 seconds, there's no chance of turning back, has been our perspective. Today, we originally had our success raising capital from foundation investors, so foundations who are investing out of their mission-related investment bucket. So this is not grant capital. It is mission-aligned. And now we are transitioning and have had more and more success among a wider audience of family offices, institutional investors, endowments, people who are returns first, impact second. And that has been a transition that at least we have seen in the last 2 years. I'm very pleased to see the conversation has shifted. And I'm reminded of that here at this conference. It seems that also the conversation has shifted.
Great. So Mary, as a financial institution, how has the housing crisis informed how you think about meeting customers' needs and coming up with different types of solutions, partnerships, or sort of other ways to collaborate to contribute to the solutions in this space?
So let me pick up on something that Jesse's talking about, and we do it kind of in 3 ways, but the first one I'll start with is that mission-aligned piece, where we can use our foundation. So we have looked at where can we really have an impact, where can we make a difference, and how can we use some portion of $444 million that we are investing in organizations, nonprofit organizations across the country to attack this issue. So we set up in partnership with NeighborWorks America a program that we call LIFT. We have several versions of our LIFT program, but it's all about down payment assistance. And we go into communities, 69 so far, and work with the local nonprofits, the local community partners, local governments. Mayors have been a big part of this because they've designated affordable housing as an issue in their communities, and partner with them to host events where we go in and provide down payment assistance, anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000, depending on the community. And then last year, we introduced, I was sharing with Jesse earlier, we introduced an additional incentive beyond that for teachers, first responders, veterans, of $2,500 to enhance the down payment assistance. And it burns off, so to speak, over a 5-year period of time as the new homeowner, largely for new homeowners, first-time homeowners, burns off over a period of time, and it's not necessarily a Wells Fargo mortgage. 2/3 of them are actually financed by somebody else. We happen to have people there if that's helpful, but a lot of people come in with a pre-approval from another lender. And that works great. We set them up online, and they now sign up in 5 minutes or less for all the appointments over a 2-day period. That's about $450 million so far of what we've invested since we started the programs, and is a big piece of it. But it's also, for instance, in the home lending space, it's new product that addresses, again, some of the things we've been talking about. We partnered and introduced a product we call Your First Mortgage, which is up to 97%. With 3% down, or as little as 3% down, as well as a simplified process and the ability to use things that are traditionally non-traditional, like gifts for down payment or closing costs. So it begins to address some of the alternative forms of resources that people might bring to the table. It's homebuyer education. It's a big part of LIFT, but it's also a big part of what we do in this first-time homebuyer space. There's a $750 credit to closing costs if you complete HUD-approved education for new homebuyers. And then financial education really more broadly in how do we invest across the board. We've made commitments to diverse communities. Jonathan's right, it's not just a diverse community issue, but the rate of home ownership for Black African American households, for instance, is at a 30-year low. So we've invested with commitments to Hispanic home ownership, $125 billion to Hispanic home ownership over a 10-year period of time, $60 billion to African American home ownership, and then $70 billion broadly to LMI home ownership. So that's happening across the retail space. And then in our wholesale organization, we're committed to affordable multifamily investing and lending sort of at the highest levels for us.
Yeah, so talk more about that in terms of like how are you addressing better access to credit or different ways of accessing credit on the supply side.
So our a wholesale team partners both for low-income housing tax credits as well as just affordable multifamily ownership, and both construction financing as well as long-term financing that enables a cost structure that can make that possible. We partner with Fannie and Freddie and do that really sort of at the highest level. So that becomes an important supply side activity across a wholesale organization.
The other factor I think that's an important overlay here, and Mary, you probably know more about this than anyone, is student debt, especially for first-time home buyers and the challenges they have in obtaining access to credit. I mean, I've talked to a number of people, family members, friends, children who've worked in New York, they've worked in San Francisco, and with the student loan debt, this talking about millennials, they're really having a challenge in not only, basically obtaining credit to buy a home, because the student loan has the first priority, right? That has to be paid. Have you seen some innovative programs that try to address, the student loan part of this? Because I mean, there's 1.5 trillion of student loan debt outstanding.
Well, and it's contributing, as you mentioned earlier, to this renters phenomenon,
Yeah.
to create more time, to begin to address it. We just introduced some Fed to private financing that allows you to go in only at lower rate, to begin to extend those payments to create a little bit of room. But what we're seeing is exactly what you all have referenced, which is a delay in home ownership that allows those millennials now to begin to get that under control. It's also the biggest down payment. That's where Your First Mortgage comes in for us, is to create some space because it doesn't allow for much in down payment. And we really do believe that some investment by a new homeowner is good for everybody, but it may be as low as 3% if you've got a number of people that are coming out of primary or advanced education that leaves you with that kind of student debt burden. But you're exactly right in terms of the delay in contributing to the renter's problem.
And I think it's important to keep in mind when we talk about delaying homeownership has traditionally been one of the ways that people build wealth over time. And so, if that is not happening, it has all kinds of downstream implications. As you were talking about looking into the future, it's not just a today problem, it's a tomorrow problem for retirement, health costs, et cetera.
Well, and what's so interesting about that too is through our LIFT programs, we see that over 40% of the new, because it's largely new homeowners, over 40% of the new homeowners are actually reducing their cost when they go into ownership as opposed to renting. So that's a path that begins to help if we can help them figure out how to start on the path.
That's right.
I just want to add that there's also, because we are talking about solutions, or we wanted to talk about solutions, there is an opportunity among financial institutions to think creatively about the issue and also holistically about the borrowers. What we have seen is that in a lot of the home buyers or borrowers, that where they get caught on the student loans, well, one, there's a phenomenon that is, I think, secular, that is people are choosing to delay home ownership. So kind of have to set that aside and know that there's an uncertain amount of people that are just choosing. I don't actually own a home myself. I'm 29, my fiance is 31. We have chosen because eventually we'll move closer to home. So there's a choice. But that aside, what we're also seeing is even among older home buyers, let's say in their 30s, who are ready to purchase a home, but still hold that student debt, where they get caught is on the debt-to-income ratio qualification. And even if we can help them with the down payment, we indirectly, but not directly, help them on their ability to pay the monthly total obligations. So what we find is that you can refinance a lot of them, coach them around this. If you refinance their student loans, they can bring down their monthly total obligation and then qualify for that loan that they otherwise would not qualify for. You have to be careful because they need to understand. It's a lot of complicated moving parts. But if you get in there with a loan officer or someone that can help them and look at their whole financial picture, they can help them with both of those options, which have kind of contributing or they help each other, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well, and those two things may not happen simultaneously. A lot of times there's a path, right, that you've got to get that kind of advice that sets you on a path that may be 2 years down the road or whatever it is to begin to get that financial picture in order to allow you to be ready. So that's another thing we're seeing increasingly is people starting much earlier to begin to, or that's the hope, is you can start much earlier to plan for it at the point at which I'm still smarting from the fact that you called older home buyers in their 30s. But
Thank you for saying that. I didn't have to say
Apologies,
that.
apologies, no offense intended.
Older home buyers to begin to be ready, but you can start much earlier in the readiness journey.
Yeah.
100%.
So let's talk about some other organizations who can be part of this equation. So Ross, when we think about employers or other kind of anchor institutions, there's been several high-profile examples recently of these organizations making some pretty big commitments around going into the housing space, and it's related to other issues that they care about, employee recruitment, retention, health outcomes for hospital systems and health systems. So they're now stepping up with these commitments. So can you touch on some of these and a little bit of how you think that may influence the market going forward?
I'd be glad to do so. It's coming both from the private sector and the public sector, philanthropy, as well as major employers. Microsoft recently committed $500 million to try and improve affordability of housing. They're having a challenge recruiting those top millennial programmers because they have the student loan debt. And so I think you're seeing employers like Microsoft. I think Amazon's probably going to do a bit more in this space as well. And I mean, that's not going to solve the problem by itself, but I think if we address this from multiple angles, we can begin to diminish the severity. Also, the Ford Foundation has stepped up with a major commitment. They're still working out all the details, but it's a range of different types of products, and basically in the affordable housing space. So we're talking, once again, teachers, firefighters, police officers, and I think there's a role to play there. To me, it's public-private partnerships that are necessary, and probably more than just the capital. I think the Microsofts and others have to show they have skin in the game, but I think they can play an important leadership role in trying to address these, because when you go to local planning commissions, you try and get the state government involved, and I was involved in this for 20 years here in California, and it can be a fist fight. And so when the private sector steps in and takes a leadership role, and they say, well, not only for attraction but for retention purposes, we have to address this because it becomes a competitive issue for our business, a survival for our business. In some cases, like Apple has major operations in Austin, the second largest base of employment outside of Silicon Valley now. And actually, I played a role in that. Steve Jobs, when he was still alive, asked me, he knew I did a lot of work in technology centers, and where were computer programmers and engineers being created, and what was the cost of hiring them, the wages and the housing costs. And I suggested you should take a look at Austin. Now, they did take a look at Austin, and now Austin has almost as many Apple employees as Silicon Valley does. So that's just to emphasize the importance of the dimension of this issue. And I think that private sector employers have to play a role. It's not just about the capital, it's the leadership. And once they show up at the table and are part of the discussion, then my term, there's an adult in the room that's trying to supervise things, that understands about capital allocation.
And interestingly, some of the data in LA says that tech employers, as an example, have been better at integrating some employee benefits and recognizing the costs and building that into wages, et cetera, whereas other industries have not yet.
Correct.
So we still have a lot of room to go in terms of employee benefits, or going back to the wage issue. We'll put that aside for just a second. We can get through some of our other questions, but come back to that, I think, in terms of influential actors in the space. So one thing we have not talked as much about at this point is preservation. So Jonathan, can you talk about what are you seeing in the preserving affordable housing, again, naturally affordable housing across the spectrum? Are there any best practices that you see are working, or what opportunities do you see in that space?
Great. So there are about 7.5 million units of affordable housing that are vulnerable for preservation. And these are approximately a third are project-based Section 8 projects that were built in the late 70s and early 80s, low-income housing tax credit units that were built from 86 onwards, and what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, Class C housing that's just kind of cheap rental. These are all in the rental housing space. And because of the pressures that we're hearing, what's happening is the pressure is to turn all this into market rate housing. Our company has an acquisition fund that, by the way, was the first impact investment of the Ford Foundation, but because of our return profile, and we're the largest social impact investment of TIA and many others, that buys existing affordable housing. We commit to preserve its affordability, and then we make the projects much greener, reducing their climate impacts, their water impacts, and the energy costs for the residents. And then to get to a point that Mary mentioned much earlier is the housing, this is a nexus of issues. So we mentioned transportation, but also healthcare, access to healthy food, access to after-school education. So with every one of our projects, we then build a health exam room and connect with local health care providers who we're bringing on-site health care. We have computer rooms. We partner with local organizations to provide after-school education and computer training, et cetera, for kids, and English as second language, job training for older people. We're bringing, have community gardens, and we're connecting with mobile food banks. We're working on stress reduction because trauma is a very big issue in low-income communities with yoga and meditation, exercise, a whole series of things. So we're using, so number one, we're preserving the affordable housing. Number two, we're using the affordable housing as a platform to connect all these other solutions too. It's actually the most cost-effective way to do that. Now, so what's interesting is that number one, this field of this effort to actually preserve affordable housing delivers absolutely market rate returns. We're from just, if you look at any real estate investment fund, we're a top quartile return. But what's interesting is in affordable housing is that it's non-correlated. So when the next recession comes, our rents don't go down. They actually are indexed and rise with the CPI, and so that gives it a kind of a rock solid annual cash flow distribution plus excellent IRR. So what we're seeing now, though, is that so much of the capital that wants to help solve the problem is moving to preservation. Another thing, it costs between $750,000 and $1 million in 7 years to build a new unit in the San Francisco Bay Area. So the city will give a subsidy of $230,000 to somebody who wants to preserve a unit because they can, in effect, preserve 4 times the units for the same amount of dollars. What we're seeing, therefore, from the political side is in city after city, whether it's New York or LA, Seattle, et cetera, San Francisco, the Denver, cities are creating acquisition preservation funds or vehicles to support, to partner with companies like ours. The second thing we're seeing is that, again, because the societal costs are so positive, affordable, we find if we, for example, give a 30-year commitment to keep a unit affordable, we'll get a 30-year tax abatement. And that actually can have substantial economic value to us that then Fannie or Freddie will lend us against that helps make the whole virtuous cycle. So this is, again, like none of these are the complete solution, but particularly in dealing with the under 60% of area median income, it's so expensive to build new units. We have such limited financial resources. America builds 50,000 new affordable housing units a year. Remember I said we have a 20 million unit gap, so it's insignificant. So the preservation side is another essential part of the problem.
So why do you think we don't hear as much about that?
Well, it's not
out there, and
it's not sexy,
Yeah.
but interestingly,
or how could
well,
we?
actually, I will phrase it.
Elevate
Returns
that.
actually are really good.
Yeah.
So the it's a very financially attractive thing. I think you will hear more about it because we're seeing more and more cities and counties creating preservation programs and trying to encourage it. I can leave it at that.
Okay. So, Jesse, are you seeing other types of collaboration opportunities or partnerships for working with school districts or housing developers or other organizations, along the side with some of the ones we talked about?
Yes, I think one of the big challenges as a leadership group within our company has been to try and figure out how to retain focus. I think there are so many opportunities for whether it be collaboration or new product introductions that I guess to name a few, some of the things that we've already touched on were student loan refinancing. There's a huge opportunity there. financial wellness programs, so coaching, just financial literacy. These are two areas that I think have virtuous feedback effects across a variety of financial insecurity challenges. For us, and we've found that the pillar on which we are building our business is one of trust, and what we are attempting to do is to build these relationships with school districts, with in certain cases unions, with teachers across the country, and execute really well on what we are trying to do, which is help the sliver of people who can afford to buy a home but can't access that home. And with that trust, then go leverage and provide other support services. Already today, for the people that cannot buy a home in the next 6 months or a year, we are still providing financial wellness and coaching to them. We haven't yet monetized that aspect of our business, so we have CFPs we work with, so certified financial planners. We have people on our team who host webinars and how to prepare Homebuyer 101, and then, if you're a year out and need to refinance your student loans, here are some things you should think about. Or 5 years out, or 10 years out, just get your budget under control. We believe that if we continue to invest in that programming, it will pay off in more partnerships with school districts, employers that will want to work with us, more customers down in the pipeline a year out, and that is. But that area is a massive challenge to kind of balance focus on what we are already executing well on, and planning for the future and other products and platforms we can deliver.
Great. So let's shift to kind of an open conversation here around policy. So clearly we've established there's a lot of things going on there, but there's also a lot of barriers that remain. And we need both long-term solutions and intermediate-term solutions to tackle the issue. So unfortunately, that oftentimes, as we've heard, runs into local resistance, NIMBYism, et cetera, to get beyond that. So what would you advise policymakers regarding how to come up with effective state policies and solutions to incentivize supply in the short term and the long term? Anyone want to lead off? Rob?
Let me take the more macro perspective on it early on. Then we get into more of the specifics. But I've worked with developers over the years, and the biggest obstacle they face is the uncertainty of how long it's going to take to get the permits. And so I've spoken to them and say, if I knew it was going to be a year and 2 months, I can deal with that. But it's the uncertainty of sometimes it could be 6 months, even in the same location. In the state of California, it might take 6 months, and somewhere else it might take a year and a half. And so it seems to me we need to use information technology more thoroughly, but also looking at the planning process more holistically, and all those points of contact kind of have to be put together to expedite this process and make it more efficient. And that is what's largely been absent here in California. You see the same thing on the East Coast as well. But there needs to be a monitoring system and tracking online so you can go check and see where you're at in the permit review process, what's the next review that's coming up. And we need to hold state and local officials accountable. There needs to be a scorecard, a set of metrics. If you don't measure it, you'll never improve upon it. And it's not something that has been monitored very closely. And I think if we can instill that into the process, and you can do that, I think you can take a lot of costs out of the system. And then the affordable housing, either the rate of return is higher or it doesn't cost as much. So that's a major policy that frankly wouldn't cost us any money, and I would say would make the process more efficient, reducing government costs. So there are things that we can do, and then of course you face the local opposition. That's always a challenge to overcome. But that's certainly one approach we can take.
So do you have some specific examples of what that would look like in terms of a policy recommendation, or where would that be initiated?
So Denver's actually done this. Dallas has as well, kind of a one-stop shopping for the development process. You don't deal with multiple agencies. They've been coordinated into one agency, and you just go to them, and they shepherd the entire process through. Now, in the case of California, you still have the CEQA issues that can come up at the last minute that can delay the process, but it's the certainty of knowing how long that process is going to take and or being able to monitor it. If there's been a delay, you know early enough, and you can plan for how much that delay is going to mean to the tail end of the development. So those are things that communities are doing, but to be quite frank, it takes a high degree of social capital to make that work, because within the same community, you can have vastly different perspectives. And one of the things that California has done in the last few years, I think has really helped, is made it easier to obtain permits for so-called in-law suites associated. So where you...
Accessory dwelling units.
Exactly. So in more predominantly single-family areas where it has been a challenge to obtain those permits, you increase density by doing that. You have grandparents moving in some cases.
Kids.
And
Coming
yes, and
back
kids. So when the
dad,
grandparents
they
no
come
longer live there, the kids move in.
Backyard. It's true.
But, I mean, those are things around the edges, but in the end, all these, there's no silver bullet, and we need to tackle this problem with multiple solutions, in my opinion.
So, I heard a comment.
Yeah, so I got
Go ahead.
So the first thing is on affordable housing. So I slightly disagree. I'm a developer. Believe me, I want a speeded up process. I work in Denver. I want more transparency in the process. But it costs $450,000 a unit to build affordable housing in New York. It costs $750,000 to $1 million a unit to build it in San Francisco. And transparency in the process isn't going to cut the San Francisco unit cost in half. So number one, and the issue is that the cost of construction, the cost of land, money cost is actually pretty cheap these days, but simply does not align with incomes. And at some point, we should talk about, part of the problem with affordable housing is people who are working cannot afford housing. So the incomes are too low relative to the housing cost. But so the number one tool that we use to produce affordable housing in America is the low-income housing tax credit. And we only allocate enough, about $6 billion a year, to produce 50,000 units. So we need to increase that by 10 times. You know, you think about how much we as a federal government spend on all kinds of other things. You think about the jobs that are created. There's all kinds of studies. The economic impact, the cost effectiveness of doing so is tremendous. The tax credit is an incredibly efficient program in which corporations such as Berkshire Hathaway and Google, et cetera, and Wells are the ones buying the tax credit. It's a very, very efficient program with very, very few government employees.
Fairly low risk.
And very low risk. So number one, we need to multiply the resources by at least 10 times. We also need to multiply, so the low-income housing tax credit, the 9% allocation, and the allocation of 4% low-income housing tax credits, tax-exempt bonds.
So what, in your opinion, would enable that to happen, to do a 10x increase?
First of all, nobody's asked for it. So number one, I'm asking for it. Literally, all the affordable housing advocacy organizations, they're so timid because we have been so beaten down. They go like, can you add 30% more tax credits? That's the current request in Congress is to increase the amount by 30% through some tricks, by the way. We need to ask for 10 times more. If there's a 20 million unit problem, we're only going to, and by the way, in the past, under Reagan, the country built its way out of the affordable housing project with a massive Section 8 program. We can do this. $60 billion a year of allocation is reasonable within the cost issues. So that's number one. Then number two is the where to build. And again, America works with home rule, so every community gets to decide its own density, and we need to figure out. So, for example, my instinct is the federal government, so you had said state, but I'm pushing a lot of federal things, should simply say, we're not going to make federal investments in your water and sewer plants through the EPA SRF funds or in mass transportation, et cetera, unless you you zone to build affordable housing next to it. On the local level, what we're seeing is a rise of what's called inclusionary zoning. So if you want a rezoning in New York City to build a luxury project, 30% of it has to be affordable. And the tax incentives work, so almost every rental project in New York City is built as a 75-25. It used to be 80-20, now it's 75-25. This again won't solve the problem, but it means every time that market rate housing is being built, and there's a shortage of that too, affordable housing is being built in better locations and in mixed income communities, which is better for the outcomes for the residents. So those two things, the dramatic increase of tax credit and the zoning that either encourages or requires mixed income housing, would be two very powerful tools.
I live in one of those small communities, though, that's impacted by local decisions.
Right.
So I happen to live in a little small town that's a suburb of Charlotte. I've been there for 30-something years. I'd had less than 4,000 people when we moved in. Great public schools, one elementary school, one middle school, one high school. Great public schools. Charlotte's exploded with growth in financial sectors and others. And so in 1996, the school board said, gosh, we need an impact fee. So we're going to assess $2,500 per unit to help pay for new schools. That proceeded. Charlotte grew. The impact fees started to grow. There was a large single landowner that owned a lot of the land. They invested in a very philanthropic way and said, we're going to protect green space. All the things that appeal, right, to the communities. We're going to set aside protected green space. And then we're going to develop. So development starts, impact fees continue to increase. The town jumps in and says, wow, we need to begin to plan here. They come in with an overall plan about 10 years ago with zoning changes and begin to introduce affordable housing. Impact fees are now up to $18,000. So the affordability question has been, I think, one of the things that's maybe lost out in this because of that confluence of local decisions in trying to keep up with explosive growth. We're now up to 30 or 40,000 people in this little community. So it is the impact of some of these local decisions in trying to deal with the needs of the residents in the community, the issues of affordable housing, the growth, and then the lack of housing, quite honestly, that we're dealing with.
So one solution for that simply is for local communities to waive the impact fees on affordable housing.
And the town is wrestling with exactly that, which is much better to do it outside of litigation than inside of litigation, right? So it's exactly that discussion that's happening right now in towns across America, particularly those that are that used to feel like suburbs and are now extensions of these larger markets.
So talk a little bit more about community support. So I know you all have supported some research that demonstrates that a majority of people in the community do support housing solutions. United Way here in Los Angeles has done similar with their Everyone In campaign that says almost 70% of people are open and supportive of having different, mixed housing in their neighborhood. So how does that factor into the equation for you?
Well, sort of to Jonathan's point, years ago it wasn't even on the list. And now we did partner with the Governing Institute and commissioned a study that came out late last year that said that something like 59% now of cities would rank it as one of their number one issues, and half of them would rank it as the number one issue. So we participate with Community Wins grants and others with mayors to go in and say, what can we do as affordable housing? Charlotte's one of those where affordable housing has become one of the most critical issues on the local agenda, on the growth agenda, broadly, in partnerships, you're right, with organizations like United Way. The role of nonprofits like Habitat and others who are in both not only the build space, but the policy space, to think about how can we use the collective power of all of those voices. It's not just one,
Right.
but how do you combine it? Because there is no silver bullet.
Jesse, your thoughts?
I do want to say that I think there is agreement on the issue, and I think that you see various stakeholders that say, yes, this is a problem. Where there's not agreement or a vitriolic minority is in, I don't want the solution in my backyard. And I can speak more to the Bay Area context where we are involved in local zoning conversations in which I am just amazed to see people come out to their city council and tell them that they don't want those homes being built for poor people. They don't want those homes being built for teachers. And it is either very thinly veiled or not veiled at all.
Usually not built.
And I'm just I went to a city council at Brisbane. This is a community just south of San Francisco who has a new, or not a new, it's an old Superfund site. So it was previously polluted and now is being cleaned up. The city is a kind of bedroom suburb, and they want no housing built whatsoever. It's about 20 minutes from 20 minutes from downtown San Francisco, and they want none. They want to keep their character exactly the same. They're willing to have, offices. They're willing to have businesses come in and pay their commercial tax, but they're not willing to let, rich people move in, much less poor people. So, it's heartbreaking. And what I'm not seeing are the business community, or large businesses come out and step up and say, you know what, I want to see you build housing or we won't do business in this town. And we're starting to see it in startups. So my fiance works at Stripe, which is one of those unicorn companies, and is now a large employer in San Francisco. They donated $1 million to the San Francisco YIMBY coalition, so the Yes in My Backyard coalition. So we're starting to see, and mind you, they called the police to this Brisbane council meeting because it got so heated. But I guess I hear that there is agreement on the problem, but what is both frustrating and heartwarming to see is that big businesses haven't realized that they're going to have to make some enemies. And small businesses, though, or medium-sized, important businesses, are starting to step up and take sides.
By the way, there's a fantastic solution in that. I happen to know this Brisbane case, which is there's a large site, and Brisbane said, we're going to zone it for millions and millions of square feet of office. And they said, literally in the housing issue, San Francisco could provide the housing, which is the most
ridiculous statement.
Bizarre statement to have made.
Yeah.
And what your idea is, so if Microsoft and Apple and Google and a whole bunch of other people said, we will not rent in Brisbane unless you provide affordable housing, that would be the wake-up call. And so $500 million from Microsoft is pretty good. That statement would be really powerful.
Yeah, I agree. That's what I meant with the adult in the room. But I think what the $500 million represents is they understand it's an important issue, but have not been willing to stick their head up yet.
Yeah.
It's going to take a few brave souls that take a leadership position and stick their head up and understand it may get whacked. But if they don't get involved, private companies, if they don't get involved, we're not going to solve this problem. I just don't see it.
So can you drill down on that a little bit more and go beyond just kind of support for additional, supply solutions, and talk about wages, right? I mean, part of this is, as was mentioned before, how do people afford,
Right.
How can we give people more living wages? Because they're both part of the equation, obviously.
They are, and I mean, what's happened is that wages have been bid up in these coastal locations that have a lot of tech workers. The service sector employees that support them, the wages have not been bid up as much. look, the national minimum wage is so low relative to the prevailing wage, it's virtually meaningless in the coastal areas of the country. And even in the center of the country, states have higher minimum wages in most all cases than the national minimum wage. But it seems to me that part of the solution is to look at minimum wages that are localized relative to the prevailing wage. And California's been doing some of this. Now, what California did wrong, and I told them when they did it, you can't have a state prevailing wage, minimum wage, that's the same in Kern County as it is in San Francisco. It needs to be adjusted for the local cost of living, housing costs principally.
LA has done a regional.
Exactly, and LA's done that. So that's part of the issue. I mean, we have seen for the first time in this recovery that wages of lower income workers are beginning to rise faster than high wage workers. This has only happened in the last 18 months. It's not going to reverse the problem, but part of the solution to the housing issue on the affordability side is to be a bit innovative in looking at setting minimum wages closer to a prevailing wage. But I would say you have to have exemptions for new entrants into the labor force so that you could have a training minimum wage, because all the studies showed if you jack up the minimum wage too much, it leads to higher youth unemployment for some period of time. You don't obtain connection to the workforce, which stunts your professional progression. So you got to be very careful about how you do this. But I think a thoughtful analysis of looking at setting minimum wages locally relative to the prevailing wage has to be part of the affordability solution. It is a component. That will not solve it, but it will help.
And just for context, because you mentioned lower wage workers are now gaining at a faster rate, but since the recession, at least the data in LA shows that the bottom 60% of earners have either been flat or actually decreased in terms of their real wages and income.
True,
So,
if you look
so
at the
there's a
whole
lot
time
of catching
period,
up
that's
to
the
do.
case. I'm
Yeah,
giving you a
exactly.
snapshot of some
Right, I
positive
just want to put that into
for a
context
change.
where like
Yes.
it may be finally changing, but it's got a long way to go.
It does.
So I think we have just about 5-6 minutes left. So I want to get some, and we've covered a lot of ground, but there's still a lot to be covered. So any additional thoughts that we either haven't touched on or something you want to elaborate to really kind of give a different insight to the audience? Anyone want to start?
So I'll just add, I was at a panel yesterday on the reform of Fannie and Freddie. And so the housing finance, and there are currently plans perhaps in Washington to take them apart. And that would really make things worse. So there are kind of foundational institutions that we need to provide low-cost mortgages to people. Now, maybe their mission needs to be refined and take them out of the high end of the market and just say that they're there to be providing affordable housing. That's totally fine with me. But they are really critical resources in providing funding for both the single-family and multifamily affordable housing markets.
I would say even at the higher than capital A affordable, it would make our job a heck of a lot harder, because in the last...
Harder if they weren't there.
If they weren't there.
Right.
So for example, we have to get approved, prior to Fannie Mae approving us as an eligible source of down payment funds, we had to go lender by lender in every market we wanted to launch and say, will you qualify us as an eligible source of down payment funds? And by the way, there's this overhang because we don't know what we can do with those loans, because it's not clear in the Fannie Mae underwriting guidelines whether or not a down payment support provided by a private company is a eligible source of funds. So having Fannie Mae there to kind of be a level setter and say, which it took us 2 years. It took us 2 years to get Fannie Mae to say, you know what, we'll buy those loans. But now that they have, it means we can go to any city in the country, and up to that conforming loan limit, we can provide down payment funds. in the jumbo market, it's still like we have some educators who are at that margin where they're just clicking over from a Fannie Mae loan limit to the jumbo market, and all of a sudden the number of lenders we can work with is just cut down because, again, we go back to each portfolio lender having to make a decision. So having some consistency of ground rules, at least in our, and I recognize it's not a universal experience, has been that it's helpful to have those agencies there.
One last thought I would have is on the policy side. And I think that state governments need to step up, and some have been doing this, to have an appeal process to when, no, we're not going to build any housing here of any type. Because we cannot address this problem when there are projects that make sense to put in specific areas, such as brownfield projects. If the local community just says no, their state government needs to have a process to appeal it, and I think that can send an important message to the local communities that may have a high level of opposition to think again, maybe I shouldn't just say no, but maybe a little bit of housing we could accept, and that would certainly help.
And the only thing I would add is this is going to take collaboration that we're perhaps not seeing naturally today in a way that's got to solve a problem that we've clearly kind of ground in the fact that it's complex and it's happening at all levels, and it's going to take collaboration in a meaningful way across all of these dynamics, whether it be the nonprofit community, broad philanthropy, private, public, to create some difference beyond just the incremental impacts and programs that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Can I just say one thing more about that is that people who agree on this idea that we need more housing, I think need to get a little bit more aligned and stop arguing with themselves if possible. There's a bill working through, I think it's SB 50 in California, that was proposed last session of state Congress and got shut down because of there was a constituency of low-income housing groups that didn't think that the bill did enough. And sorry, a little bit of context. It's a bill that says that it's easier basically to build higher density housing around transit. Right. And the bill was shot down last session because there wasn't enough affordable housing included, which may be true. I actually don't know, and it very well could be true. But I think there's a little bit of, we need to get aligned in the room around who believes in building more. And I would just love to see us get there, because we have bigger battles to fight with people who don't necessarily agree.
Mm-hmm. So I think in closing, I mean, one of the questions that I keep coming back to is what do we want our communities to look like? Do we really believe in shared prosperity in an authentic way? And do we really want to have people who, contribute to the economy at all levels, be able to have safe, place to live, a place to work, et cetera? And is that what we want, or do we want more and more of the extremes? So I think we really have to think about that from all these angles, and what's the long-term vision that we share. So thank you for joining us, and panelists will be around for a few more minutes if you have any individual questions.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.